Welcome to this evening's online event entitled Recognizing Palestine: What's Next for Ireland, Spain, and Norway, facilitated by the Palestinian Return Centre. We will be touching on the Irish, Spanish, and Norwegian government's recent and timely decision to recognize Palestine, what this decision entails, should those governments be doing more, and what is next after the efforts to recognize Palestine have been achieved. Our first speaker of today's panel discussion is Richard Boyd Barrett. Richard is an Irish People Before Profit Solidarity TD. Boyd Barrett helped to organise mass protests against the war in Iraq in 2003 as chair for the Irish anti-war movement. He has continuously politically fought for Ireland's Israeli ambassador to be expelled and to place sanctions on Israel, for its brutal treatment of Palestinians, and for the end of the apartheid regime. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Farah, and thanks to the Palestinian Return Centre for asking me to speak and for all its great work in advocating for the people of Palestine. I think certainly judging from the international response to the recent decision of the Irish government to recognise the state of Palestine, many people across the world, and indeed many Palestinians, were celebrating this announcement by the Irish government of Palestinian state recognition. And of course, in the context of the absolute horror of the genocide that Israel is inflicting on the people of Gaza and the decades of denial of the crimes of Israel in its brutal occupation of Palestine, in its decades of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, in its brutal system of apartheid, the siege of Gaza, and most recently, an actual genocide taking place, and the complicity of Western governments in supporting and arming and justifying Israel's crimes and giving Israel impunity for the horrendous crimes that it's committing. It's understandable that people would celebrate this announcement. For those of us who for many years have been campaigning for Palestinian rights and seeking to highlight the historic and terrible injustice that has been done to the Palestinian people, it was a bittersweet moment, I would say, in that we're very aware that the Irish government were forced to make this announcement. And it took the horror of the last 8 months, the massacre of more than 37,000 people, tens of thousands more injured, the absolute barbaric destruction that we've seen in Gaza. It took that level of horror, and most importantly, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people coming out on the streets, outraged at the horror that was being witnessed in Gaza, that it took that in order for the Irish government to finally recognise the state of Palestine, when they had been promising that they would recognise a Palestinian state many years before, but never did so. And of course, they didn't do it because the Irish government continues, even now, very much so, to wish to stay within the club of the European Union, many of whom states and as a union itself continue to provide support and arms and favored trade status to Israel, and they continue to maintain friendly and largely uncritical relations with the United States, who of course are deeply implicated in the genocide in Gaza, for their support and arming of the Israeli regime. And without that support, both from the European Union and from the United States, Israel would simply not be capable of inflicting the horror that it inflicts on the Palestinian people. So for us, we're very aware that the Irish government have been dragged kicking and screaming, and only because of this horror and the enormous scale of popular mobilization and outrage that has been expressed by ordinary people into Palestinian state recognition. But what they have not done and are effectively refusing to do is impose any meaningful sanctions to go along with that. They hide behind the European Union in saying that because they're tied into European Union foreign policy, they're not in a position to impose sanctions. They refuse, despite the overwhelming calls from the Irish public to expel the Israeli ambassador and to impose the sort of sanctions that the movement of Palestinian solidarity in this country has been calling for decades, to impose the sort of comprehensive economic, political, diplomatic, and military sanctions on Israel that were imposed, for example, on the apartheid regime in South Africa. So while they've been forced to rhetorically acknowledge the Palestinian state, they are refusing and resisting the calls to back that up with the sort of actual sanctions that would deter Israel from its genocide and seriously challenge this regime that is capable of genocide and that for its entire existence has been inflicting such terrible suffering on the Palestinian people. And you may say, or people might say, well, at least they've done it now, and isn't that better than nothing, and shouldn't we give them some credit? But of course, part of the reason that Israel is capable of reaching the new level of horror and obscenity that we have seen over the last 8 months in Gaza is precisely because countries such as Ireland, many others in the European Union and the Western world have failed and refused to ever take any action against Israel for the decades of oppression and persecution and ethnic cleansing and apartheid that it has inflicted on the Palestinian people. It is that refusal to take action and the impunity, the effective impunity that Israel has been granted, that really is the reason we have seen this horror, that Israel feels it can get away with the horror it's inflicting on the Palestinians. And while Israel was certainly very annoyed at the Irish government for recognizing a Palestinian state, it's clear that without meaningful sanctions, Israel is going to continue its horrific actions in Gaza and its ongoing ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, and has no intention, essentially, of changing its direction. So, while at one level, we need to see this as an important victory, unless it's backed by meaningful sanctions, which the Irish government show no sign of imposing, we really have to recognize that it is only the mass movement that forced them into this announcement that can force them to take the next step, which are the comprehensive sanctions and the complete boycott of the apartheid and genocidal state of Israel, and the imposition of this sort of meaningful sanctions that would actually impact and could hopefully start to create something of a domino effect internationally, as was the case with apartheid South Africa, where it was the actions of protesters like the Dunstore strikers that finally forced the Irish government in the 80s to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. And that played an important part in the international movement of boycott that finally assisted Black South Africans in dismantling that regime. So it's a step forward at one level, but there can be no illusions that this means that the Irish government, on its own volition, is going to take the sort of measures that are necessary. Now, at a rhetorical level, it is talking about reviewing the agreement between the European Union and Israel that gives it favored trade status. And you would say, well, that's a good thing and that's a demand of the movement. But simultaneously, the Irish government are planning in the next very short space of time to support Ursula von der Leyen in her bid for a second term as the president of the European Commission, which is absolutely shocking. Ursula von der Leyen is deeply complicit and responsible for the horror Israel has visited on the people of Gaza, because she stood shortly at the beginning of the genocidal attack. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu, effectively gave the green light for what Israel was going to do in Gaza, and of course continues to allow the European Union to arm and support in very many ways what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. So there's a deep level of hypocrisy in the Irish government, who mouth solidarity with the people of Palestine and take this sort of formal symbolic step of Palestinian state recognition, but then simultaneously continue to back precisely the political forces in the European Union who are up to their necks in complicity with the genocide that has been imposed on the Palestinian people. So what I would say is, insofar as we've seen some pressure exerted on our government and other governments to talk about Palestinian state recognition, it is that movement that is the key to taking the next steps that we want to see that could actually seriously challenge this genocidal regime. And that challenge has to take the form of meaningful sanctions and comprehensive sanctions against this state, and critically a recognition, because the Irish government keeps talking about the two-state solution, but what of course that means, and I think the Return Centre is very aware of this, the two-states solution, what it actually means is a sort of legitimization and an acceptance of the apartheid state of Israel. It means, in effect, giving away the right of return to millions and millions of Palestinian refugees who've been expelled since the Nakba of 1948. And the Irish government, even now, won't use the word apartheid when talking about this regime. And we have to demand that not only do they recognize, a Palestinian state, but that they de-recognize, de-normalize, delegitimize the apartheid state of Israel, the occupation, and demand that the only just solution to the situation the Palestinians face is to dismantle the regime that occupies Palestine, that is capable of genocide, that is guilty of apartheid and ethnic cleansing, to make way for the right of the Palestinians to return to their homeland and to have a Palestine where everybody is free and equal, and where this colonial apartheid regime is fully and finally dismantled. And I think that continues to be a struggle we have to fight, but maybe we can take heart from the fact that the huge mobilization, the actions of students occupying campuses and forcing their colleges, as has happened in Irish colleges recently, to break off ties with Israeli academic institutions and so on. It is that grassroots mobilization that is the key to forcing the next steps that are necessary to show real solidarity with Palestinians on the way to genuine liberation and self-determination for the Palestinian people.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your invaluable insight there. It's always an honor to hear from you and to host you. Our next speaker of today's panel discussion is Nora Buraz. Nora is a Spanish journalist. She is specialized in international law with a master's degree in higher international and European studies from the University of Granada. She focuses on everything that affects Palestine, Arab countries, human rights, and international relations. She has been chosen to begin her master's degree in international reporting with RTVE, Spain's public news channel, in the next academic year. She's a member of the BDS movement in the city of Granada, and she's also part of RESCOP, RESCOP, the Spain Solidarity Network against the occupation of Palestine. She also has a radio program on her own called Shireen's Voice, in honor to the Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh and to the more than 140 Palestinian journalists who have been killed by Israel. The podcast is a space to find out the latest news about Palestine and also for analysis and reflection on everything that is happening. Over to you, Nora.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Farah, and to the Palestinian Region Center for creating this space. It is truly an honor to stay here with all these great voices. So, about the recognition of Palestine by Spain, what this decision means. The recognition of the state of Palestine or any state is a legal diplomatic act and is a unilateral action. Any state can go ahead with it without the approval of the European Union. It reinforces relations and gives Palestine its place in the international community. Now 146 countries consider Palestine to be a state with essential rights such as sovereignty, territorial integrity, and its independence in a legal sense, not applied yet in reality. And the recognition of states is the basic thing for establishing international relations. So Spain's decision to recognize Palestine is significant but insufficient and comes late. It's significant because the Palestinian cause was almost forgotten by the international community. Before October 7, the Abraham Accords were normalizing relations between Arab countries and Israel, and Saudi Arabia was very close to joining them. At the September session of the United Nations General Assembly, Netanyahu showed a map of the Middle East where only Israel appeared, occupying the entire territory of historical Palestine. It is an insufficient action because a genocide is happening right now. There are more than 40,000 people dead. There is no safe place in Gaza. They are dying of hunger. Every day there's a new massacre, and this recognition doesn't in any way affect the hell that the Palestinians are going through. And this decision comes late. The president of Spain, Pedro Sánchez, already promised in the 2015 electoral campaign that he will recognize the Palestinian state when he becomes the president of the government. He came to power in 2018, and it took 6 more years of silent genocide and 9 months of live accelerated genocide to take this step. What consequences has this recognition had? First of all, the withdrawal by Israel of its Israeli ambassador to Spain, Rodica Radian Gordon, when Spain announced its intention to recognize the state of Palestine. Later, Israel tried to order a ban on not providing service to Palestinians at the Spanish consulate in East Jerusalem. The Spanish Foreign Minister Alvarez rejected this ban because Israel doesn't have the power to do so, and reminded him that our consulate that has an historical status protected by international law, and it has been operating long before the creation of Israel. The joint step of Ireland, Spain, and Norway influences the European states. Recently, Slovenia recognized the state of Palestine on June 4th. Belgium and Malta also announced their willingness to do it, but it seems it's not going to be immediately. And as we said, it has no real consequences for the population in Gaza and in the West Bank. We need real pressure measures to paralyze Israel's capacities. If Spain and Ireland and Norway really want Palestine to be a state, they have to apply an official arms embargo and cut off economic and all type of relations with the Zionist entity. This will isolate Israel, and this is the real respect for international law. And I want to talk also about the recognized borders, because Spain, Ireland, and Norway have proclaimed the borders that the United Nations considers official prior to the Six-Day War in 1967, and this Palestinian territory represents only 22% of historical Palestine. This is the so-called two-state solution, which is not a solution because Israel doesn't want to recognize this or any borders of Palestine because they want to occupy all of Palestine because they are a colonial power. And for the pro-Palestinian Spanish organizations, we don't legitimize Israel because it is a Palestinian territory occupied since 1948. And it represents a contradiction with the right of return of the Palestinians expelled from their land, and who are today 6 million refugees who are prohibited from returning to their homes. Justice has to be complete, otherwise it is still injustice, and the colonization must be complete. So we only validate these borders as a temporary transition. Even Hamas, in a recent interview for the Associated Press with the political official Khalid al-Hayya, he said that Hamas is willing to agree to a truce of 5 years or more with Israel if an independent Palestinian state is established along pre-1967 borders, and also the return of Palestinian refugees. And also in the 2017 Hamas statute, they also value the 1967 borders, and at the same time, they reject any alternative to the full liberation of Palestine. Let's make that clear. They want a Palestine free from the river to the sea. A true state of Palestine is a state that has been liberated. From Spain, the pro-Palestine organizations demand this. There is only one true solution, and it is Palestine without occupation. On another matter, I want to point out some declarations of the Spanish government on the recognition of the Palestinian state. On May 28, President Pedro Sánchez mentioned Israel during his speech, but not to condemn it for any of the crimes Israel is committing, but to dedicate nice words to them. The president said that the recognition of the state of Palestine is a decision that we do not adopt against anyone, and even less against Israel, a friendly people whom we respect and appreciate, and with whom we want to have the best possible relationship. At that day, Netanyahu and Gallant already had a request issued by the International Criminal Court for an arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza. How it is possible that we don't say anything, and on top of that, we say that we respect and appreciate war criminals? We cannot recognize the state of Palestine and at the same time continue to reinforce Israel's impunity. And what does all this mean on a global level? The recognition of Palestine is a message to Israel that we won't recognize any more occupation beyond the pre-1967 borders, a message that makes Israel angry, but nothing more. But I want to share a visual thought with you, and I think it's powerful. Imagine a blank wall with a name half erased on it. Israel has tried to eliminate Palestine since its creation and was almost erased from the wall of the international community. But these recognitions of Palestine mean that someone is going to paint the name of Palestine in that wall again. Continue claiming that Palestine has the right to exist. This is the symbology that I see with the recognition, with Palestine. So where are we going and what we can do? Recognizing the state of Palestine is incongruous if we don't take real pressure actions to stop the occupation and genocide. And if governments want, they can't make these actions. It is urgent to proclaim an official arms embargo. Our government says it has applied, but it is not true. And various investigations have shown that Spain has continued to buy weapons and security technology from Israel. And from the pro-Palestinian associations, we have led social protests against ships that intended to stop at the port of Cartagena in Spain, carrying weapons whose final destination was Israel. And thanks to the social pressure, we have managed not to be complicit. So we have to continue working collectively and demand of governments the measures that can really stop the hell. The boycott in every way to Israel is essential. So keep going. So once we have seen injustice, you cannot away. So let's not fall into the culture of defeat that is what Israel would like to see us tired. And remember that the solidarity movement for Palestine is much stronger than Zionism because it's humanity against dead souls, and the light always conquers the darkness. So keep fighting. Long live the Palestinian resistance, and Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nora. It's always an honor to hear from you. Our next speaker of today's panel discussion, we'll be hearing from Berna Abuzaluf. Berna is a PhD candidate in international law at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. Berna is a Palestinian interdisciplinary researcher. Her research interests are epistemic oppression, transitional justice, intersectional and decolonial solidarity, decolonization, TWAIL, and international law vulnerabilities. Over to you, Berna.
Thank you, Farah, and thank you for the Palestine Return Center for inviting me again to speak to you. Today, I will be covering mainly a commentary as a Palestinian on the recognition of Palestine. So not long ago, we witnessed massacres of Palestinians taking refuge in supposed safe zones in Rafah and Khan Yunis. As a response to one of the many massacres, Micheál Martin, who was the Irish Minister of Foreign Affairs, described it as barbaric. But his words ring hollow. The Irish government, among many others, are patting themselves on the back for recognising a Bantustan Palestinian state, but refuse to do what Palestinians and the massive solidarity movement have been asking them to do for over 9 months. The main demands, echoed by the movement, are sanctions and cutting off of all diplomatic ties, among other demands. Instead of any commitment to any of these demands, the Irish government is still evidently complicit, as shown in a report released by Uplift that indicates that Ireland exported over €70.4 million worth of dual-use goods to the Zionist entity in 2023. Those goods were used both for civil and military purposes. Moreover, ironically, they invited the Zionist ambassador to attend the Irish famine commemoration, while Gaza is actively being starved during a genocide. Let alone, they allowed the use of Shannon Airport for US military aircraft transporting military equipment used directly on the genocide of Palestinians. Instead, the government decides to recognize the state of Palestine in a two-state solution framework. At the time of the release of the report, I mentioned how the recognition was simply a form of political gaslighting, or a softer form of damage control, or maybe you can call it a carrot. There are 3 reasons why this recognition is actually not surprising. First, historically, Western states have endorsed the two-state solution in an attempt to thwart the Palestinian right to self-determination and return from the river to the sea, or in other words, to save Israel, as some US officials declared. The recognition needs to be viewed as a renewal of the commitment of these complicit states in the coercive so-called peace process. Another reasons for the revival is a falter of the normalization deals between Israel and Gulf states, and with the rise of influence of China on Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East, Western imperialism's position in the region is threatened. The weakening of the Zionist entity is therefore seen as dangerous for the imperialist interests of Western powers. The recognition can also be recognized as a response to this danger. For Norway, this recognition is rather ironic because of their historical involvement in the so-called peace process signified by the Oslo Accords. The Norwegian minister Jonas Stor's comment on the recognition shows the vague tone but clear message by which Norway assesses this recognition as a road to the two-state solution. He says the decision is in support of moderate forces, and I quote, in support of moderate forces that are on a retreating front in a protracted and cruel conflict, end of quote. This sentence could itself warrant a whole piece of literature on how Western governments view both the Palestinian Authority and the 76-year-long settler colonial erasure. He adds that the two states, which he arrogantly envisions, must have, quote-unquote, logical territories. One must ask where he envisions Israel to land, on which territories does it reside, but on Palestine, which is colonized formally in 1948. Second, there is no double standard when it comes to Western powers. The only standard applied to Palestine is the imperialist and colonial standard. The Irish government, along with Norway and Spain and others, will not support sanctions against the Zionist entity because it contravenes the basic pillar of the imperialist standard from which the US is dictating. That a national liberation movement will always be demonized as long as we live under the current imperialist world order. The Spanish government's statement explicitly mentioned that a two-state solution is endorsed by the international community. This international community here is a euphemism for the imperialist forces and their allies. Spanish government also proposed that, and I quote, after violence ends, end of quote, to hold a peace conference. According to several reports, more than 80 countries have approved this proposal of a peace conference. It shows that the pot is brewing for the elimination of Palestinian cause for liberation. One could ask, is a call for a peace conference a fair response to the simple demand for an end of impunity against a genocidal entity? In essence, those states view the genocide in Gaza as alarming, not because of the genocide itself, but because it can result in the impediment of the two-state solution. In essence, the recognition of Palestine stands as recognizing Israel's right to exist as a settler colonial entity. This reaffirmation is useful here because it clarifies again how the three entities are anxious about the rise of more open and widespread support for decolonization and resistance globally. Third reason is the recognition of Palestine can only be seen as an effort to legitimize the Palestinian Authority, whose interests align with Israel and has proximity to the US, but also as a way to legitimize the resistant forces in Gaza, along with resuming Western's monopoly over violence. The Spanish statement clearly states that they view PAs as the Palestinian Authority as a moderate, but also as a legitimate partner in peace. This is why it's important to understand historically how the PA aligned itself with Western powers and Israeli security needs on the expense of aspirations of Palestinian people and their own security. Furthermore, Israel government officials have publicly stated fears of the collapse of the Palestinian Authority's collaborationist and corrupt regime. Not only does it serve Israel's security interests through the security coordination stipulated in the Oslo Accord, but PA officials also tacitly express support for the genocidal campaign against Palestinians in Gaza because they endorse the destruction of the resistance forces in Gaza, which for them is the opposition. So to summarize in simple words, after 76 years of ongoing Nakba, settler colonialism and genocide, the international community still believes it has the right to dictate what Palestine should look like. The solidarity community in Ireland has been one of the strongest, most vocal movements internationally. It is appalling that the Irish government can pat itself on the back for doing absolutely nothing for Palestine and Palestinians, and all of these hundreds of thousands in the streets protesting for Palestine month by month. This is similar in Spain and Norway and others. After witnessing day after day massacres of Palestinians in Gaza, it is difficult to see what interests keeping the diplomatic ties with a fallen colonial entity of Israel serve for the Irish, Spanish, and Norwegian governments. The people have been vocal enough. There's no doubt that not only the ties need to be cut, but divestment and sanctions implemented immediately. At this stage, these governments have strong liability for aiding and abetting genocide through the exporting of dual-use technology, weapons, and active contracts with the Israeli defense industry, all whilst presenting themselves as having a neutral position publicly. So why do these governments not realize that Palestine is a litmus test that they are continuously failing? They will continuously fail if they ignore in various ways their entrenchment in Israel's genocide. History will remember how these governments have tried to shelve their complicity by hoping the movement will die down and the history will forget. Contrary to this, the movement is still going strong with more meaningful solidarity emerging. I cannot, as a Palestinian, foresee how the international community will use the recognition of Palestine, but to yet again enforce its partition of Palestine into smaller Bantustans for the sake of damage control, or enforcing the peace, as my colleague Brendan Brown notes in his work. The recognition cannot be celebrated during an active genocide that the international community can put a stop to. On the other side, when Palestinians chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they chant it not as a metaphor, but as a process of rightful decolonization, liberation, and return, and as an acknowledgement of the ever-clear effort by the international community to impose a settler colonial reality on Palestinians, a settler colonial reality that is masked under the recognition of the state of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Berna, for your breakdown there. It was very interesting to hear your points, especially on the points of there isn't really anything to celebrate through this recognition. Thank you again, Berna, for your time. Our next speaker of today's panel discussion is a representative from the Palestine Committee of Norway. The Palestine Committee of Norway was founded in 1969 and is an independent national solidarity organization that works to spread knowledge about the situation in Palestine and to influence Norwegian public opinion. The Palestine Committee has branches in all major cities and several towns in Norway. Over to you.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you for inviting us. I'm Charles. I'm Deputy Chair of the Palestine Committee in Norway, and I'm very happy to be in this panel. I mean, it's a lot to learn, and I hope we can sort of be able to work together in the future time. Especially to Bana, of course, I agree with you about what you said on the Norwegian government. I mean, as I will comment it a little later, but of course they are still supporting the Zionist state of Israel. I will not repeat what you said. I think I will concentrate on what we are doing in Norway and what is special about Norway in this matter. Norway has historically been one of the most faithful supporters of Zionism. The UN's first Secretary General was the Norwegian Trygve Lie, and he was one of the initiators of the establishment of the State of Israel. Later on in 1959, Norway secretly sold 20 tons of heavy water, which is essential for Israel when they are developing their nuclear weapons. So, and Norway never asked how this heavy water was used. As mentioned before, Norway was behind the Oslo Accords, which has cemented the oppression of the Palestinians for so many years. There has been a long-standing cooperation between the Norwegian and the Israeli intelligence services and security cooperation through the EU and NATO. The so-called oil fund, the government pension fund global is the correct name, is the world's largest capital fund and has invested some $13 billion in companies that contribute to the occupation of the West Bank. According to the organization Don't Buy Into Occupation. The oil fund has invested some $1.5 billion in Israeli companies and $10 billion in international arms industry, now supplying Israel with weapons. This according to the American Friends Service Committee. The Norwegian state-owned arms industries produce weapons or weapon parts that Israel uses now in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. This includes parts, missiles, and ammunition for the F-35 fighter jets that Lockheed Martin exports to Israel. So we can conclude that the Israeli occupation and genocide in Palestine is big business and highly profitable for Norway. You can say that Norway's foreign policy has two command centers. I mean, the one is the foreign ministry and the other one is the leadership in the oil fund. So what happened when Norway recognized Palestine? We realized there was a change of course when Norway, in opposition to the US, which has never happened before, they voted for a ceasefire in Gaza, first in October and then in December. And of course, we were very happy when Norway defended UNRWA in January, increasing funding rather than cutting it, as many Western countries did. This change of course came, of course, as a result of prolonged pressure from people in Norway. The public opinion has changed, and mainly this because of the brutality and the killings in Gaza, but also because of the long-term solidarity work by the Palestine Committee and other activists. The government was also pressured by trade unions in Norway, and Norway's largest trade union, with more than 1 million members, has called for boycott and sanctions of Israel for years. And the ruling Labour Party's youth organization has been campaigning with us. Several local branches of the same Labour Party had for many years demanded that Palestine should be recognized. And in the end, it was too difficult to find excuses why the Labour Party voted against recognition in the parliament. We are, of course, happy about the recognition. It is an important symbol. It is a symbol that, of course, the Western world sees. It's a symbol that can change world opinion, or at least the European or American opinion. And of course, leaders in America, Israel sees it. There's no doubt that this is a big problem for Biden, for Netanyahu and other leaders. And of course, the recognition supports all our arguments for a free Palestine. But the big question is, of course, will there in Norway be changes in real politics? If the real politics does not change, the recognition is of very little value. And Norway will continue to stand on the side of the occupier. But I believe it's not possible to both go for a Palestinian state and at the same time contribute with weapons to the murder of people of the state we just recognized. It is not possible to recognize Palestine and at the same time invest in Israel occupying Palestine. Norway cannot continue to make money from Israeli occupation and bombing of Palestine. The Norwegian people will not accept this in the long run. I think in the long run we will win. And based on this, we have some main points for our work following up this our government's recognition of Palestine. And the first thing we are doing is in collaboration with several large organizations such as Amnesty, Save the Children, the trade unions of Norway and Norway People's Aid. We have a campaign to make the oil fund sell its shares in the occupational industry and from the international arms industry that supplies Israel with weapons, and of course from Israeli companies. At the same time, also we are collaborating with several organizations. We work to prevent Norwegian weapons ending up in Israel. According to Norwegian law, it is forbidden to sell weapons directly from Norway to Israel, but it is possible to send ammunition, weapons and weapon parts to the United States, where they are assembled into complete weapon systems, which are then exported to Israel. The former Norwegian minister, foreign minister, he said that, or she said last year that this is fine as long as the weapons do not appear to be Norwegian. The Norwegian authorities do not require an end-user certificate for weapons or weapon parts sold to the NATO countries, and this is something we want to change. We also want an end to Norwegian state-owned factories in the United States and Spain selling weapons and ammunition to Israel, as they have been doing for the last months. We are also working for a legal ban on trading with companies that have interest in the occupied West Bank. The Norwegian government has advised Norwegian companies not to import goods produced in the illegal settlements. But we demand that they go 2 steps further. I mean, there's so little produced in the settlements that end up in Norway, so this is not really important at all. What we ask them to do is that they introduce a legal ban, not just an advice, and that the legal ban should also apply to trade and investments in companies that have interests in the occupied West Bank. With the recognition of Palestine, there is a demand from the Norwegian government that there should be a 2-state solution. This is the same all over Europe. And this is where we can see that the Zionism in the Norwegian government is still there. The foreign minister further says that there must not be a Hamasistan and that Israel should be a Jewish state. Up against this, we demand that the Israeli apartheid regime must end and that the Palestinians must be free to choose both how the state should look, what its state should look like, and how they could select their own leaders. My 5th and last point is Norway's complicity in the genocide in Gaza. The Norwegian government has assessed that what obligations they have to prevent genocide after the ICJ delivered its ruling on the 26th of January. They conclude that Norway can go on as we do now. But they neither mention the oil fund nor that the Norwegian arms industry supplies Israel with weapons or weapon parts. Several lawyers are very critical of this government assessment and believe it is deficient. They see it as a commissioned work. We believe, and UN experts agree with us, that this can make Norway complicit in the plausible genocide in Gaza. So there is a lot of work to be done still, but I think the recognition of Palestine gives us an opportunity to strengthen our work, and this gives us an opportunity to use our strength against Norwegian politicians and officials for a free Palestine. And hopefully we can work together in the months and years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time and your powerful words there. It's always good to hear from different comrades from around the world, from Spain to Ireland to Norway. Thank you again for your time. Our next speaker of today's panel discussion and today's final speaker is Dr. Alice Payne-Pinto. Alice is a reader in law at Queen's University Belfast, where she researches, teaches, and publishes on international law, human rights, and transitional justice, with a regional focus on the Middle East. Her most recent project on the displacement of Palestinian Bedouins, in collaboration with colleagues at Al-Quds University, Trinity College Dublin, and Liverpool John Moores University, was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Prior to joining Queen's University, Alice worked at Warwick University and outside academia on human rights and international law issues in the Middle East. When Alice lived in Palestine, she worked with a wide range of institutional, academic, and civil society partners. Alice is a member of the Board of Trustees for Law for Palestine. We do have a pre-recorded message from Alice, so we will play her video now.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you virtually, and thank you very much for the invitation from my friends at PRC. It's lovely to be back again. My name's Alice Payne-Pinto, and I'm a reader in law at Queen's University Belfast. If we can now pull up my slides, I'll talk you through some of the key issues that I thought might be worth discussing in relation to the recognition of Palestine by 3 European states just last month. So the focus of my talk will be on the right to self-determination or political discretion. And as I mentioned, I'm an international lawyer by background, so I'll try and bring in some perspectives from my discipline. So as you see, this is a smiley photo of what the caption that was generated automatically for the image said, 3 men in suits. These are 3 political representatives of the state of Ireland, Norway, and Spain on the occasion of their states recognising Palestine on the 28th of May of this year. I apologise for the typo, it should say 2024. As you see from this map, which I took from Al Jazeera, and it's linked in the comments to this slide, now we have quite a considerable amount of states throughout the world that recognise Palestine as a state, right? So it's approximately 146 countries, which is quite significant. However, as you see, the states that remain white in this map are the states that do not recognise Palestine. And of course, you see the US, Canada, Australia, and many Western European states, as well as a few states scattered across Africa, Asia, and South America. Let's have a look at Palestine's recognition as a state in international organizations. And by international organizations, I'm referring predominantly to the UN family, right? So in 2011, UNESCO granted Palestine full membership. As a result, a number of World Heritage sites, including sites at risk, have been placed under the category of State of Palestine. And that places Palestine on a par with all other member states of UNESCO where World Heritage sites are and where World Heritage sites are at risk. The following year, the UN General Assembly voted in favour of changing Palestine's status to non-member observer state, and that remains at present the status of Palestine within the United Nations. However, in April this year, the UN General Assembly adopted a fresh resolution that suggests an upgrade of the state of Palestine within the UN as of September as an observer state. And it urges the UN Security Council, the executive body of the UN, to consider favourably the Palestinian full membership, right? And I cite from the resolution, the state of Palestine is qualified for membership in the UN in accordance with Article 4 of the Charter of the United Nations and should therefore be admitted to membership. Of course, this is contingent on the Security Council as well, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think this is important framing because the fact that the UN General Assembly issued this resolution in April, I believe empowered Ireland, Spain, and Norway to take the step to recognise Palestine shortly thereafter. What does recognition mean, right? It means many things. I've just indicated a few words here for us to reflect on. The political dimension and the legal dimension are the primary ones that come to mind, at least sitting in my disciplinary space. And for both, I think there's a conversation to have around the symbolism of these three recognitions and the material effects. Now, the symbolism, both political and legal, of Ireland, Spain, and Norway recognising Palestine cannot be understated, right? These are important steps, they're timely and perhaps long overdue steps, but most importantly, these are three Western European states, two of which are within the EU, and one, of course, is within the region of Europe, three states that, in a sense, have broken from the rest of the West and taking this important step. Now, we all know that this year, since October 2023, has been a particularly troubling year when it comes to the international community's treatment of Palestine. The war on Gaza, I'm sure, requires no further elaboration on my part. But the fact, for instance, that the International Court of Justice is currently investigating that context through the lens of genocide is significant. And I think, situating the recognition by these three European states at this particular juncture in time is relevant because it sends an important message to Palestinian victims. It also sends an important message to the rest of the West, right? Countries within Europe and further away that are hesitant to lend their full political support to Palestine and Palestinians at a time when Palestinians need international support so desperately. And yet again, they've been let down. So that's my conversation around the symbolism. I've been brief. Obviously, there's much more that can be said, but I think I want to move on to the material effects. Right? What are the political and legal material effects of recognition? Now, this is a good question. I think skeptics might say, in a way rightly, that recognition means nothing in material terms. Unfortunately, the recognition by Norway, Ireland, Spain of Palestine as a state this year has not improved the situation of Palestinians, neither in relation to their day-to-day lives. The war in Gaza is ongoing, the situation in the West Bank is deteriorating, the situation in East Jerusalem is as bad as it has ever been. But also on a global stage, the material effects of Palestine are still, how shall I put this, are still not evident. We have a number of cases, for example, before the international courts. I've mentioned the ICJ proceedings instigated by South Africa against Israel on the question of genocide in Gaza. But there's also an open investigation at the International Criminal Court on a range of war crimes in relation to the situation in Palestine. The focus right now is on Gaza, but the list of alleged crimes includes a number of issues such as settlements that affect the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. So, for instance, the material effects, both politically and legally, of this recognition could, and I argue should, result in greater support by these three countries, and indeed all countries that have already recognized Palestine as a state, for these courts in their work, empowering them and giving them the strength and peace of mind that they are acting on behalf of the international community. Let's move on. So, becoming a state in international law is a topic which fascinates scholars to the present day. There's a lot that can be said on becoming a state, and I will be as brief as possible in illustrating the two main theories, right, that relate specifically to recognition of other states, of a new state entity. So the constitutive theory indicates that recognition is required, it's a necessary act, before the recognized entity can enjoy an international personality as a state. Whereas the declaratory theory sees recognition as merely a political act, recognizing a pre-existing state of affairs, right? So in the first instance, for the constitutive theory, recognition is required for Palestine to become a state. But for the declaratory theory proponents, recognition changes nothing, right? Because the fact that Palestine is a state is not contingent on whether or not other states recognize it as such. Now, international lawyers and other academics are split on which one of these is the most persuasive, and I'll give you a bit more of my thoughts on this topic further on in the talk. But I think the key point is whether or not the three states last month recognized Palestine. That tells us something at an international level that doesn't really say much and doesn't add much to the fact that Palestinians have a right to self-determination that is almost abstract, right? It doesn't rely on any other state recognizing the right to self-determination, as we will see in a moment, is something that Palestinians have. It's a right that they have regardless of whether or not other states recognize Palestine as a state. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the problems with the recognitions that we've seen recently by Ireland, Spain, and Norway. So I apologize for the text-heavy slide, but this is, I think, important just to pinpoint some of the issues. So all three statements that I reviewed indicate that the two-state paradigm is what we are working with. This is the UN's position as well, and it's widely supported across the international community. However, this isn't the only position that Palestinians have on the future of Palestine. And this is important to point out, the fact that the three men in suits of the first slide endorse the two-state paradigm is all well and good. However, it doesn't fully take into account the variety of positions within the Palestinian population on this particular point. And it also endorses a historic injustice, the injustice of partition, that was imposed on Palestinians in the 1940s, first in the British proposals, and then in the UN's adoption of that paradigm for all future dealings. And another issue, I think, that emerges as problematic in the statements is the ambiguity over Jerusalem. And I'll return to this in a moment in relation to one of the statements in particular. And in terms of framing, I think all three statements make an explicit reference to 1967 as the start of the occupation of Palestinian territories. Now, and of course, we all know that that encompasses the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. However, there's a much broader conversation to have, and for many, the occupation of Palestine began with the Nakba in 1948, And indeed, earlier than that, when during the British Mandate, the Palestinian elite and indeed the Palestinian people were stripped of their opportunities to grow politically and enjoy positions of political authority within their communities because of the structure of the British Mandate, which is a colonial structure, but also because the parameters of the British Mandate enabled a European organization, primarily, which was affiliated to the Zionist movement, to take over the key positions of authority within mandatory Palestine. So the fact that 1967 is seen as the start of the occupation and the borders is all well and good. However, there's a broader conversation to have around historic injustice. And I think we see a little bit of that in relation to the Irish statement, but it's not spelt out as much as it perhaps should be. So let's look at three aspects that emerged as I was reviewing the statements. So the Irish statement indicates that there will be a full embassy of Ireland in Ramallah, which is interesting because the international community's position is split, of course, on the capital of Palestine. But for Palestinians, the capital of Palestine is Jerusalem. And to my understanding, I'm not Palestinian, that has not changed. So it's interesting that Ireland has taken it upon itself to elevate Ramallah to the seat of its embassy, as opposed to making plans perhaps for an embassy also in Jerusalem. Let's look at the Spanish statement. What I picked up on here, as well as in the Norwegian statement, was the portrayal of Hamas as an intransigent party. Now, one doesn't have to be a fan of Hamas politically or socially, right? But I am going to say what I'm going to say out of fairness and, in a way, objectivity. The Spanish statement indicates that Hamas is against the two-state solution. While this is correct in relation to the constitutional documents of that organization, it's only partly true. Because in 2017, an official statement by Michel indicated that Hamas would be ready to accept the 1967 borders as the basis for a Palestinian state, with Jerusalem as its capital and the return of refugees, right? This was, of course, within the context of an internal political dialogue between Hamas and Fatah. But it also illustrates that the intransigence with which Hamas is portrayed, usually by Western states, doesn't fully capture the complexity of this organization in its political space within internal Palestinian politics. And I'll return to Hamas also in relation to how Norway discusses it in its statement, right? Terrorism and violence from Hamas and other militant groups undermine the trust that is so essential to achieving lasting peace. It's hard to disagree with this statement, taken in context. However, when Palestinian armed groups target members of the Israeli military and police, now that is not terrorism, right? Under IHL, international humanitarian law, there's a principle of distinction, which is one of the cornerstones of international humanitarian law, that also applies to occupations. And the principle of distinction separates civilians from military personnel, right? And of course, Israeli civilians are protected as civilians and should not be targets. But Israeli military targets are legitimate targets in the context of war, and that includes in the context of occupation. So the fact that Norway doesn't quite articulate that distinction is problematic, because it suggests that everything Hamas does is terrorism, and that's not quite true. So all three statements also seem to support the Fatah leadership within the Palestinian Authority. which is interesting, but again, it needs to be taken in context. Again, I'm not Palestinian, and our Palestinian colleagues may be able to talk about this in more detail. But Fatah is not the only political party in Palestine, and indeed, there's a much more complex conversation to have in terms of who represents and who should represent the Palestinian people based on, well, who the Palestinian people choose to be their representatives. But let's see what the three statements get right. And they get one thing very, very right, and that's the right to self-determination, right? The right to self-determination is contained in Article 1 of the UN Charter, and it's one of the purposes of the United Nations, right? So friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of people, right? There are a number of successive documents by the General Assembly and many other bodies within the UN over the years that reaffirm the right to self-determination as core in the international legal architecture. Most recently, the ICJ, in its advisory opinion on Chagos in 2019, considered self-determination as a jus cogens norm. That means a norm that is applicable everywhere and against anyone, right? And this is one of the most solid norms of international law, which elevates self-determination above many other rights, all other rights sometimes, right? It's the right to have rights as a people. And the Palestinians have the right to self-determination by virtue of being a people. And this is also the position of the international community, right? And the UN General Assembly resolution of April this year, the one that seeks to elevate Palestinian membership within the UN, recalls some of these documents of the UN over the years, right? So the right to the Palestinian people to self-determination and the right to the independent state of Palestine has been recognized in General Assembly resolutions from the 1970s until the present day, right? The withdrawal of Israel from the Palestinian territory occupied in 67 is also important in relation to the right to self-determination, right? And that is, again, illustrated in a range of UN documents over time. And of course, the illegality of settlements. We know that settlements are illegal under IHL, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, but there's also a political statement which is important, a UN Security Council resolution of 2016 in the last month of the Obama administration. And the US did not veto this resolution. And that is really important because we know that settlements are illegal not only under international humanitarian law, but they are seen as illegal by the UN and by the UN's executive body, which is the Security Council. So after recognition, what can states do to give effect to the right to self-determination? Because it's not just about recognizing the state of Palestine as a state, but it's about giving effect to the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. This is a question primarily for politics, not a question primarily for law, because there are so many different ways that politically states can give effect to the right to self-determination. But I've got a few suggestions based on my own discipline, right? So first of all, ensure Palestine is not a black hole within international law. International law violations that occur in Palestine need to be treated like international law violations treated occurring in any part of the world. So Palestinians who are victims of international law violations should not be left alone. And this is both in relation to the current situation in Gaza, where we know over 40,000 people have been killed by Israeli attacks and many, many more wounded, with the entirety of the Strip deemed uninhabitable. But it's much broader. It's about the situation in the West Bank, where state-backed settler violence is rampant and terrorizes Palestinian communities in Area C primarily, but also elsewhere, forcing so many communities, many of whom are very vulnerable, herding and Bedouin communities, to flee. And they flee for their lives. So Palestine cannot be left as a black hole within international law. And that's one thing that states that recognize Palestine can do: take action to make sure that Palestine is not a black hole within international law. Following on from that, Palestinians should be able to enjoy their human rights on a par with all other people, wherever they are. This is a question of equality and fairness and non-discrimination. And this, again, is something that law is clear about, but the way that states might operate is, of course, up to various states to decide politically, right? But they should feel empowered to support Palestinian human rights in all and every forums where this is relevant. And let's think about the perpetrators. We've spoken a lot about the Palestinian right to self-determination and the Palestinian people's rights, both individually and collectively, but let's talk about the perpetrators as well, right? We know that the State of Israel perpetrates a range of international law violations in Palestine, and however, despite ample reporting by the UN agencies, by a range of international human rights organizations, local human rights organizations, Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations, eyewitnesses in Palestinian communities, many journalists, we have ample material. Despite all of the evidence of international law violations, it's rare for perpetrators to be held to account. Now, just last week, we've seen a slowing down of the ICC's investigation into the situation in Palestine, based on the United Kingdom's move to reopen some jurisdictional matters at a juncture which is unusual in the procedure of that court. Now, that of course means that perpetrators of international law violations are going to be let off the hook for a longer period of time, which is problematic. Now, of course, the UK has not recognised Palestine, despite calls from a number of quarters that it should. But states that have recognised Palestine could perhaps use their diplomatic influence to ask the UK and other states interfering with the work of the international courts to step back and let the international courts do their job in fairness, with transparency, and to ensure that international law is upheld in Palestine as well as everywhere else. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for inviting me again. Thank you to all of our friends at PRC, and have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.